Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. I'm talking with Father Wade Menezes. Father Wade Menezes is someone I consider a friend, and his book, Stand Firm and Be Strong, has been one of the best, frankly, one of the best books I've been blessed to read, let alone write a blurb for. But I also want to share that by virtue of this book, he is now launching a daily podcast and this book is tremendously well received, and he's launching a daily podcast to share wisdom, chewable wisdom for men every single day to dive deeper into their call of being virtuous, holy, sons of God, men, husbands, and fathers. Father, thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
I'm doing great, Marcus. Thank you so much for having me on to help promote the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Oh, the joy is completely mine. As soon as I saw your email, there was no way I was going to say no, and I know you knew that. So let's begin, Father, by revisiting the blessing of your book. Share with us about what the book's about and the way you structured it.
Sure. So Stand Firm, Be Strong is a men's Catholic daily devotional of Scripture and saints. It's got 200 days worth of meditations, which is just over a 6-month period. So I call it effectually my 6-month spiritual manual for men. All 200 days have a topic at the top of the page of this daily reader titled Stand Firm, Be Strong. And then 3 things follow the topic of the day. In order, those 3 things are the following: a scripture quote on that topic, a saint quote on that topic, and Father Wade's short meditation on that topic. So it's meant to be a 5 to 8 minute exercise each day for the men as they begin their day. And what inspired me to write it, it came out in November of 2024, so just under 2 years ago, was that I personally felt that as Catholics, we greatly lacked in the daily devotional format for men, specifically for males, whether single, married, widowed, or as consecrated brothers, priests, deacons, or bishops. So I wrote it with all vocations and all states of life in mind. And it has done very, very well in its first year and a half. Again, it's been out almost 2 years now. It's done so well that EWTN itself pitched to me as an idea to do a daily podcast of the daily 200 days worth of meditations. So we launched on Monday, August 3rd, a 200-day podcast that's in strict and direct conformity with the book. So, for example, day 1 of the 200-day meditations of the book from November 2024 when it came out is titled Commitment. Well, day 1 of the podcast is titled Commitment. But where the book is meant to be a 5 to 8 minute exercise each day for the man as he begins his day, the podcast just extracts the main pertinent points of that day's meditation, and the podcast is under 5 minutes each day to inspire the man to go deeper in the book. So, for example, what are some of the topics of the day, both spiritual and secular topics of the day? Well, the committed man, I already said. Commitment, accountability, strength and fortitude, having no duplicity or guile, shunning sin and vice, the importance of weekly Eucharist, the importance of monthly confession, the reality of the devil, authentic fraternity and brotherhood, the demands of virtue and aiming towards salvation, the virtue of diligence, seeking the truth, the need for humility amidst not only trials, but also amidst successes. Humility is needed both during trials and successes, right? Confidence, the athlete of God, and others. So a good peppering, if you will, of both spiritual and more secular or temporal topics that are in the book are corresponding directly with the 200 days format of the podcast.
Father, the last time we spoke, one of the things you highlighted was how crucial it was for you to make sure that these things are bite-sized. I invite you to share why that is.
Yeah, well, because we're all busy, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we all want to start our day with a kernel that will ground us, root us. It will cement us in that day's living of pursuing and seeking the good, the true, and the beautiful. And I think a daily devotional format is a great way to do that, whether it's in book form or whether it's in podcast form. And I think that's why the book has been so popular with guys. You know, it's precisely because the book has done so well with male readers that EWTN pitched the idea for the podcast, because the book itself has proven to hold men's attention as a committed daily exercise to strengthen their spiritual and temporal lives. And so my hope, Marcus, is that the podcast will likewise strike at the male heart and spark the male intellect, if you will, to help men live their vocations more fully and committedly. You know, I'm very much in your face in my introduction of the book that this is meant for singles, marrieds, widowers, consecrated priests, brothers, whether diocesan priests or religious order priests, religious order brothers, even bishops. So regardless of one's vocation and state in life, I want this book to really help men ground themselves and continually help them to form themselves in pursuance of the true, the good, and the beautiful, both by looking at these secular topics and these spiritual topics, because it's a peppering of both categories, okay? It's not just strictly a spiritual book. And to help the man really form his life, whatever that vocation is, whatever that state in life is, help him form his life around the truths of our one holy Catholic and apostolic faith.
When I read your book, it became abundantly clear that you are very in your face, if you will, with the language of the book, and I was so appreciative of it. And to that end, Father, I want to, man to man, I want to ask you to speak very clearly into what is truly a crisis of manhood, not just in the secular culture, but also in the church today.
You know, we live in a day and age that tragically downplays authentic masculinity and what that means. Mm-hmm. For example, whether it's the prevalence of television commercials that frequently make the husband or man look like a buffoon, to the misguided direction being offered by various movements on the internet, you know, the so-called manosphere. What it means to be a man in the authentic Christian sense is greatly attacked today. And a good model for all men, whether a layman or a cleric or a consecrated religious man, is to look, for example, and this is just one example, there's others, but to look to the life of St. Joseph, the true just man, the man who never spoke a word in sacred scripture, and yet he lived his vocation fully as provider, leader, and protector. Another one, I think, is St. John Paul II, you know, and his 26-plus year pontificate, and the equilibrium he had with his emotions, his passions, his feelings. He was able to keep everything in check. And I think that's another great role model for us is the life of St. John Paul II. You know, I think Dr. Tim Gray of the Augustine Institute, I believe he's currently the president of the Augustine Institute, he reminds us that the virtues give us the blueprint for being a man. And indeed, the very term virtue comes from the Latin word for man as male, which is vir, V-I-R. To be man precisely as male, the Latin word is vir. Now, for mankind or humankind, meaning both men and women, the Latin word is hominess. Well, we're not talking about that. We're talking about vir, V-I-R. It's the same Latin root, the Latin word for man precisely as a male, where we get the word virtus from, okay, the word virtue from, which signifies what? It signifies power, strength, and ability. So thus, the virtues are habits that give us the power to act in a manly way with strength sufficient to do what is right. So in other words, without virtues, we will neither be godly nor real men. And the virtues are thus the building blocks, we could say, of manly character. And without them, a man's moral life will eventually collapse and will do so under the pressures of the world. So Stand Firm, Be Strong, both in the book form and the podcast form, both are designed to help the man pursue virtue and virtuous living in his daily vocation.
We'll talk with Father Wade Menezes. He is author most recently of Stand Firm, Be Strong, a men's Catholic daily devotional of Scripture and Saints, and now the host of a new podcast on this same book. We're going to continue on the other side of the break. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Reed. I'm talking with Father Wade Menezes, author most recently of Stand Firm, Be Strong, a men's Catholic daily devotional of Scripture and Saints. He's also on EWTN Open Line every Tuesday. Father, when I listen to you on Open Line, I think it becomes very clear that so much of what you're dealing with in terms of the questions and the way you answer it communicates to, at least me, because I know you and I know the book, that this desire to be a virtuous man comes forth in how you live out your spiritual fatherhood. And so much of the doctrinal confusion we're seeing in the church could in some ways be attributed to men not rising up and taking on the charge of spiritual leadership and immersion in doctrine and in the life of the church. I invite your thoughts there.
Yeah, I do believe very strongly that men in the church do need to step up more, because of their very vocation as men. John Paul II talked about this in his Theology of the Body, where regarding the feminine genius of women, it's nurturer, comforter, and nester, where for the male, it's provider, leader, and protector. Not that the two genders cannot share in one another's natural gifts. They surely can. We've all heard the phrase, for example, don't poke mama bear, because she's going to protect her young. And that's a beautiful thing. There's nothing wrong with that. All John Paul II was saying was that each gender has its particular gifts. Doesn't mean they can't share in the opposite gender gifts, but each one has its particular gifts. And for the male, for the man, it's provider, protector, and leader. And whether it's the protection of the virtue of his children as a husband and father, whether it's the protection of the virtue of his parishioners, his flock as a parish priest, a bishop over his entire diocese or archdiocese, whether it be the single man at his place of employment and work and wanting to share virtue and virtuous living with his fellow co-workers, both male and female fellow co-workers, we're all called to do our part. As St. John Henry Cardinal Newman says, we all have a role to play. We all have a significant role to play in this great gift that's called our life. And the question is, what are we going to do with it? And for men, it's to address these issues, or these areas, I should say, of providing, protecting, and leading, to give our all to help transform the world. You want to help transform the world? Where do you begin? You begin with yourself. That's where you begin. And that's something that cannot be lost sight of, I don't think. And that's why I state in the book, and the same goes for the podcast, I state in the book's introduction, if you're a 14-year-old male that is a freshman in high school, or older, all the way up to your 80s and 90s, if you're 14 or older and you're serious about living your manhood, you're serious about living your faith, you're serious about giving your all as a man in modern society, and what that means in the pursuance, again, of the good, the true, and the true, the good, and the beautiful. This book and this podcast are meant for you, and you're meant to incorporate them into your daily life. That's why I didn't want to change the title of the podcast. I asked EWTN to keep the podcast title the same as the book, Stand Firm, Be Strong, only to promote it as a podcast format rather than the book format. The book's full title, as you've already said, Marcus, is Stand Firm, Be Strong, a men's Catholic daily devotional of Scripture and Saints. Well, the podcast is titled Stand Firm, Be Strong, and we could add the subtitle of a men's Catholic daily podcast of Scripture and Saints, because I keep the pertinent points the same of the book. And whatever the topic is for that certain day, it's the same exact topic for that certain day on the podcast, And so I wanted to keep things simple, So, for example, day 69 in the book is titled A Real Man is a Virtuous Man. And I quote Ephesians 4, verses 29 through 32. And I quote St. Alphonsus Liguori as the saint of that day. And then I give my short meditation for that day. Well, day 69 of the podcast is the same exact title. A real man is a virtuous man. And I say this, an important point for men to remember is that the Latin word for man as male is vir, V-I-R. Vir is a Latin word that provides the etymology for the Latin word virtus, implying power, ability, and strength. Virtus in English is simply the word virtue. The important lesson here, to be manly is precisely to be virtuous. Do not forget this. And that's how I end the podcast. So they're snippets, but they take the most pertinent points of the book and put them in a 5-minute or less podcast in a daily format.
Father, there's no doubt that one of the things your podcast is going to do is it's going to be an alternative and a remedy for all of those other, unfortunately, toxic content that's out there in the world. And I invite your fatherly wisdom here. What's the draw? Why would people be drawn and find alluring the message of people in the manosphere when clearly that leads to nothing but selfishness and wanton depravity?
It's interesting. I think everything ultimately is meant to lead us back around to God, even when we get off track. This is part of the exitus and reditus doctrine of the Catholic Church. Exitus meaning we come from God, and reditus, the Latin phrase, meaning we are called to return to God. So, for example, one thing that's gaining a lot of traction right now on the so-called manosphere is the so-called looks-maxing movement. Okay, well, that has to do with the so-called the handsomeness, the beauty, etc. But as human persons, Marcus, we are naturally attracted to beauty. Mm-hmm. We are naturally attracted to beauty. Why? Because God calls us to an ultimate end with Him, eternal beatitude, the beatific vision. And to get there, we are called to pursue in this life, while still living, this average of 79 years. The latest longevity statistics say that we live for an average of 79.4 years for men, 79.8 years for women. We are called to pursue what? The good, the true, and the beautiful. Because the human person is naturally attracted to that, okay? The problem is we're getting off track and looking for it in finite things, like with the looks-maxing movement. And that's where the problem is. The devil will take something good, and he will manipulate it, contort it, and twist it, and want to turn it upside down to make it something that's not. Okay? And that should be no surprise to any of us, right? Because the word diabolus in Latin, devil, comes from the Greek diaboline, okay? And what does that mean? Diaboline in the Greek or diabolus in the Latin. It means to contort or twist. It means to rip apart a whole. It means to turn upside down. It means to make it topsy-turvy so it has no stability. This is what the word devil means. This is what diabolus in the Latin and diaboline in the Greek means. And I state this in the book. So I'm really hoping that guys will take the timely wisdom of the podcast, go deeper into the book, and it will help men to prepare to put on the armor of God for their daily struggles and help them withstand trials both at home and at work. Because the trials at home and at work can be many, right? And so they got to learn to put on the armor of God and how to deal with the daily situations that we call life. And I'm hoping it will also help enkindle in them a stronger prayer life, better utilize the sacraments, better utilize their own talents. We all have our own talents. We all have our own gifts. And order their priorities in their daily living. And it will help them ultimately to imitate Christ in guarding their senses and responding to temptation in a proper way. All important factors, I think, when navigating life in this third millennium, whether as a man or a woman, but I'm addressing specifically the men here. So again, Stand Firm, Be Strong, a men's Catholic daily devotional of Scripture and Saints for the book, and Stand Firm, Be Strong, a men's Catholic daily podcast of Scripture and Saints. To access the podcast, all they got to do, Marcus, is go to EWTN.com. Right now, the podcast is found on 3 rows. It's found on the podcast row, the growth and spiritual life row, and also the spotlight row. And so it can be found on any of those rows at EWTN.com, which at the home page, what we call the front page when you first go to a website. When you first go to the website, that's the home page or the front page. Just simply go to EWTN.com and you see all these horizontal lines of different shows and series and podcasts. Right now they have Stand Firm, Be Strong listed on 3 of them. Again, the podcast row, the spotlight row, and the spiritual growth row. And we launched the 3rd. So, and we're posting a new podcast every day. We began on Monday, August 3rd. So today is the 8th day of the podcast having been launched. And so right now we have the first 8 days of the podcast, which are also, incidentally, the first 8 days of the book. Same exact 8 topics that appear in the book are the same exact 8 topics that appear in the podcast in the same exact order. The podcast corresponds directly with the book, and they can listen to an under 5-minute podcast in the morning as they begin their day to help strengthen that day and keep them on track and go deeper even more with the book.
Father, of course, even as you share this, you want everyone, if they first come to the podcast, to begin where they're beginning, from the beginning with the book, and to go day by day, because you want them to get the full 200-day experience. So share with us about how, regardless of where we start, it's the journey in this entire Stand Firm, Be Strong journey that matters.
Yeah, you bring up a great question, because that's precisely why I did not calendarize the 200 days.
Oh, yes, yeah.
6 months. Like, I did not calendarize it from January 1 to June 30th or from July 1 to December 31st. I simply went day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, all the way to day 200. Why? Because things come up in a man's life where he might have to set the book aside for 4 or 5 days. Let's say the family's moving to a different state, and you know, it's a big move for the family, right? So he's going to have to set aside the book for 4 or 5 days. He's able to do that and just come back and pick up where he left off.
Father, as usual, thank you very much for your time, your wisdom. I'm talking with Father Wade Menezes, and I want to greatly encourage every man listening right now, and frankly, every bride and child, encourage your fathers and the men in your life to sign up for Stand Firm, Be Strong, the podcast, and then procure a copy of the book, Stand Firm, Be Strong, and Journey for 200 Days. I'm Marcus Peter.